Well, Merry Christmas. Welcome to this beginning of our Christmas series, our Advent series called Let There Be Light. And Advent simply means the arrival, the coming. And I think as we engage in this march that we're going to make from now till Christmas Day, it's really important for us to try to situate ourselves not just in the realization of what it means for Christ to come for us, but also what it meant for him to come into the entire world, in particular to the people who were waiting so desperately for him, and what kind of relief it could have been for them if they had only seen. If any of you have ever had the experience or the privilege of having someone that's really close to you that has, maybe you were in regular contact, like I was talking to one of our congregation a couple of weeks ago, and she said that her mom had passed away this past fall, and this was the hardest part, was that right now, every day, she used to have a conversation with her at 10 a.m., and that was missing. And there was something about not having that voice, that sense of encouragement, that guidance that she missed, and that was going to make Christmas really difficult for her. Maybe you've experienced that, where someone who has had a significant impact in your life and you got used to hearing from them regularly was now gone. When we find the story of Christmas, of Christ coming into the world, that's what's been happening with the people of Israel. They had had prophets, they had had kings. Someone speaking for God was constantly in their life, always giving direction, encouraging, and telling them what was coming. Often, that encouragement and direction looked like correction, because they found themselves often in this same cycle that you and I find ourselves in. It goes like this. Everything is good. Then we decide we're going to do things our own way. We choose to sort of rebel against God or minimize him. And then we get ourselves in trouble. And then we need help. And so we say, help me, God. And he does. And then we say, oh, thank you. And we're good again for about 5 minutes. And then we decide, you know what? Maybe I'll try again. My own direction. And we do. And then we need help. You know the cycle, right? You've been there. That was the story of the people of Israel. Constantly choosing to try to do things on their own and constantly finding that the results are disastrous. Well, they always had someone to tell them that hope was coming, help was on its way. But when we find Jesus showing up on the scene, it's been 400 years since anyone has spoken for God in that way. You and I, we pick up the Bible and we turn the page from Malachi, who's the last of the Old Testament, the last prophet. We flip one page over and it's Matthew. And we get the story of Jesus' birth, and it's so incredible. But that one page turn was 400 years. Imagine when you've been used to hearing from someone regularly, 10 generations of silence. They had to wonder if maybe they had messed up so badly now that God had given up. Were they beyond help, beyond repair? The darkness that seemed to cover them just got worse and worse and deeper. In fact, they had already been through enslavement by the Assyrians, and now they were under the thumb of Rome, who taxed them heavily, who forced them into labor. Their religious figures had only a form of religiosity. It was piety with no power. There was no authority that was being spoken, and it was dark. Isaiah, one of the prophets who told the people about what was to come, 800 years before Christ's birth, wrote the words that the West family spoke just a little bit ago. Thank you so much. But first, before Isaiah said those hopeful words, he said this in Isaiah 8. He was describing the situation that the world would find itself in. Distressed and hungry, they'll roam through the land. When they're famished, when we've all out of our ability to feed ourselves, our souls, will become enraged, and looking upward will curse their king and their God. Then they'll look toward the earth and see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom, and they'll be thrust into outer darkness. This is the picture of the world without the light of Christ. It's dark. And if any of you had a child or were a child that had an irrational fear of the dark, you know just how debilitating this can be. Anybody here raise a kid that was super afraid of the dark? And I don't mean just like the kind that's nervous in it, but like the one that will not go upstairs on their own, that has to have your hand. Whenever you're dealing with someone who has a paranoia of the dark, you can't rationalize them out of that, can you? There's no talking them into everything is okay, I promise it's safe. Because in the dark lurks all the things that we are terrified of, all the feelings of not just fear and uncertainty, but being alone, being abandoned, the interminable night that seems to come whenever you're struggling. Do you remember those nights? We've all had them. Either it's because you were in the middle of processing grief or sadness, and it just seems like the night won't stop. You can't go to sleep. Maybe you've been up with a sick child all night. Do you remember just how long the hour between 3 and 4 a.m. is? It doesn't stop. But then do you remember what it feels like the moment that the room starts to light up when dawn is coming? Do you remember that relief? That's what happened on that day all those years ago when Christ was born. The light actually dawned on the world. As a reminder, this is what Isaiah said, that the people that were walking in darkness have seen a great light. And on those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. When the light appears, everything starts to change. We're doing this series because I want to show you over the next few weeks how if you will choose to let the light in, everything in your life can change. Indeed, it has changed, whether you recognize it or not. But to help us kind of use a different side of our brain to sort of get situated this first week, I wanted to do something a little bit different. I wanted to engage the part of us that sometimes we put on hold when we come to church, and we don't have to. And that's our brain. Some people believe and have walked away from Christianity because they think it's just logicless faith that you just believe, close your eyes, and trust like a ride in Disney World, that everything is going to be fine, right? And yet, if you are bored with Christianity, it's not God's fault. He has built into this creation, and through science, we now actually are finding out so much about who He is and what He's doing that you don't have to be bored. So don't unengage your brain for the next few minutes, and would you welcome me as we bring up Dr. Bradley McCoy. Dr. McCoy is the chair of physics, math, and statistics at APU, Azusa Pacific University, and he's come today to share with us a little bit about light. And so, Dr. McCoy, would you come up and would you give him a warm St. Andrew's welcome? Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
Math, physics, and statistics. That sounds like a lot.
It's good fun.
Yeah, and so here's what I'm going to ask you to do. This room is filled with people who are smart enough to grasp what you're going to say, but just in case, pretend like you're just talking to me who didn't have a degree in physics and may not gather everything at the level that you would normally teach it at. So we're going to make this like layman's terms.
Right, no problem.
And we're going to start simple. Real just easy question. What is light?
So light is an electromagnetic wave. What that means is if you have charged particles like protons or electrons and they vibrate, they create in the space around them electric fields and magnetic fields that are also vibrating, and then those vibrations travel outwards through space, and that's what we call light.
Electromagnetic wave. I got that part. And there are different, what do you call it, frequencies, right? Different wavelengths
Yes, different frequencies
of those. Tell us about what some of those are.
So visible light that we can see is at wavelengths of about 400 nanometers on the green side to about 600 nanometers on the red side. If you go longer wavelengths than that, you get things like infrared, microwaves, and radio waves. If you go shorter wavelengths than that, you get ultraviolet, X-rays, and gamma rays.
Gamma rays, like what made the Hulk.
Sure.
This is my level of physics. I did take it in high school, though. So before we go any further, one note. I'm going to make some connections to God, and you just need to know that God is transcendent. You cannot fully describe or make Him clear by anything that is in the creation. So recognize that this is not going to solve the mystery of who and how God is. But what I do want you to hear is that He is embedded in everything He's made, clues and evidence for us to grasp because He wants to be known. And there is in what we're going to talk about in just a moment, not perfectly, but some ways that you might be moved to understand God more deeply after today. So that's my, I used to do voiceover work. That's like the fine print at the end, of the caveat that says, wherever we mess up, it wasn't His fault, it was mine. That's basically what I'm saying. So light is electromagnetic wave, but we talked about earlier, there's also another way that you describe it. Not just a wave, but particle.
Yeah, it can also be described as a particle. So there are some classic experiments where if you take two slits and you shine light through those slits, on the other side, if you project it on a screen, you get not just two spots, but you actually get a whole series of spots. And what that tells us is that light is a wave. It's going through the slits and it's interfering with itself, and we get this kind of mesh pattern that shows up. So you can do that experiment and it definitely works. But if you do that one photon of light at a time, it goes through the slits, and then what you see on the screen is not that whole pattern, but just a single spot. So at the moment that we measure that one photon, it acts like a particle, even though it was a wave as it was traveling to that location.
So it's wave and particle, and Einstein talked about this and said that this was one of the great mysteries that we just had to live with, because sometimes it acts like either, and you can describe it with either of those. Here's the thing, though. What you're saying is light has a wave nature and a particle nature, like dual nature.
Yes, it definitely does.
So does that sound familiar to you? Like we talk about Christ, who has full God, divine nature, and full human nature, that he has both 100% in him and who he is. And so when it says that that God is light, that Christ is the light of the world, I just want you to think about the implications of that a little bit, what he's given to us. So, okay, that's what light is. Tell me about this. The speed of light seems to be a fairly important thing. What is the speed of light, and why is that so important?
We call the speed of light a fundamental constant of nature. So it's a number that is always the same. All light travels exactly the same speed. That speed is 300 million meters per second. So very, very fast.
Say that again.
300 million meters per second.
300 million meters per second.
Yes. So where this is important is it's the fundamental speed limit of anything in the universe. So if you take an object and you try to make it go faster, maybe you strap it to a rocket or something, you have to give it energy to make it go faster. And as it gets more and more energy and gets closer to the speed of light, its mass actually increases, so it gets harder to make it go faster from there. And if you were going to try to get it to the speed of light, you would actually have to give it an infinite amount of energy. So that's just utterly impossible for anything to ever reach the speed of light, except for light itself, of course.
Okay. And that speed is so important because, we were talking about this a little earlier, as you get faster and faster and you approach the speed of light, some funky stuff starts to happen, right?
Yes, very strange things happen.
Tell us about that.
So we are used to living in a world where we're moving much slower than the speed of light, but if things start move to close to the speed of light, space and time kind of get weirdly mixed together. So to illustrate what that means, if you have like a meter stick that's flying past you at very close to the speed of light, you could measure its length, and it would be less than a meter. So things actually compress when they're moving very fast.
Okay.
They also have their time slow down, so if there was a clock mounted on that rocket ship that's flying by, that clock would run slowly. We call that time dilation.
So it's almost as if at the speed of light, time doesn't matter.
Yes. So if you had something moving at the speed of light, the time that would actually pass for it is just zero. So light takes no time to travel from one place to another from the perspective of the light, even though from our perspective it does look like there is time.
So this is how Matthew McConaughey looks so good at the end of Interstellar, even though he had been gone for a long time. Like, it basically slowed down and didn't change for him.
Yes, his time had slowed down.
Okay. When I think about God we talk about him being outside of time, right? This is a sort of a way to even understand and describe that. Because light, we said this, so light that is streaming through these windows right now, that's coming from the sun, for us, it takes time to get here. And it's like 8 minutes and 20 seconds for it to reach the earth. But for the light itself, it's both there and here at the same time.
Right. If you could put yourself in the perspective of that light, the space between us and the sun would be just shrunk to a single point. So it would take no time at all for it to get there. It would just be instantaneously there. So time doesn't really exist for light in that sense.
Is this not fascinating to you? So God is omnipresent, because also light is everywhere, right?
Yeah, all of space is filled with light. Even the darkest parts of space, there's radio waves, which are light. They're just light that we are blind to.
We can't see. And God is
I liked the word omnitemporal.
Omnitemporal. So tell me about this. When we're thinking about the gap between when the prophets spoke last and then when Christ comes, right, for us, that feels like 400 years. We talk about how long that wait is, or if any of us have been waiting on God to answer a prayer or to show up. It feels like forever, but for him, it
feels like no time has passed at all.
Wow. So maybe my impatience is my problem, not God's, is what you're telling me.
Probably.
Right. Light is matter, but it doesn't have mass.
Correct.
So talk about that a little bit, especially when we think about God becoming human, like putting on flesh, to make that connection for us.
Yeah, so we have matter. We are made of protons and electrons that have mass. Light does not have mass, so in that sense, it's very fundamentally different from us. It behaves according to different laws than what govern our physical reality. But with the dual nature that we were talking about earlier, it actually does behave when it is interacting with particles as though it was a particle. So for example, if you have like billiard balls and you're colliding them together, we can calculate like what angles they're going to go off on after the collision. If you do that same experiment with photons of light, it travels like a wave until it hits the particle, but then it interacts with it just like the billiard balls would do, and it would just have a collision.
Okay, so I'm just going to keep going because that is, but when I think about Jesus being fully God and then becoming fully human, and we see him and we experience who and how God is, it's kind of like he begins to relate to us in that way.
Right.
Like a human. It's fascinating. Okay, last one, because one of the things that light does for us is it shows us color. Sure. Which is really great. I would hate to live in just only a black and white world, and God is so good that he's given us that. But color comes because of light. So like, is this shirt actually purple? Sort
of. So color is really determined by the wavelength of the light. So 600 nanometers is red, 400 nanometers is green.
You just know that.
Yeah, I've memorized it.
Right.
So the exception is white. White is actually the combination of all of the colors of the rainbow at once. So the sun is giving off all of those colors simultaneously. They come through the skylight, they get to us. We see them all simultaneously, and our brain processes that as white. So when that light hits my shirt, some of it reflects off and then goes out to your eyes, and you perceive that. So what you're seeing is the stuff that reflected off of the shirt. So this shirt is reflecting purple. It is absorbing stuff that is not purple.
Wow. We didn't practice this or plan this question, but just as you're thinking about, us considering God being light and all the stuff that you know about light itself, what leaves you in awe of God with all this information you have?
Oh, that's a big question. That it all works so well. So I love that God has created a universe that has orderly laws that I can, at least to some extent, understand, and they're very self-consistent and predictable, but yet there's so much mystery in the world too. There's so many different ways so much variety in the ways that those laws can get applied.
And in fact, while they're the laws, one of the things we said is when you're observing light and its action, you can't actually predict how it's going to behave when it's observed.
Right.
It's like it knows that we're watching.
Yeah, so with the experiment that I was talking about with the two slits and you shine your light through, you can't actually say that it went through one slit or the other slit because you get the whole pattern that comes from both slits simultaneously. So I can't measure it and say that was the slit that went through. If I put a detector on one of the slits, the whole pattern goes away. So I can at best say that there's like some probability of which slit it went through, but I can't say exactly it did this.
Wow. Which also to me sounds like many of our experience of God. There are things about him that are constant and unchangeable, his character and his nature, and yet the way that he behaves sometimes I cannot predict.
Yeah, mysterious.
And that is why we worship. Because if you and I could completely understand God perfectly, there would be no need to worship him. But the fact that he leaves us in awe of things like photons and particles is really, really unbelievable. Simple things like that. Dr. McCoy is going to be out on the plaza, and he's got some experiments and some demonstrations after this. If you want to talk to him about that or try to wrap your mind around quantum theory, he's got some stuff. We can talk about string theory and all that a little bit later. That's another sermon, but I'll prepare you for that one. So I just want to say thank you for helping us to see God in a new way today. And could you guys thank him for this time? The reason that I wanted to turn today into a little bit of an 8th grade, 12th, 13th grade science class is because I actually believe that when you read what we're going to base the rest of this series on, and you start to put in your mind that God is somehow like this light, when he calls himself light, it can help you to understand him a little bit more, appreciate him a little bit more. I wanted you to get that as the foundation as we start. Because here's the passage of Scripture that we're going to be basing the next few weeks on. It's found in John chapter 1, and in that, John is describing God coming into the world in Christ. And he goes all the way back to the beginning of the Christmas story, which is actually the beginning of our story. Here's what he says in John 1. In the beginning was the Word, that's Jesus, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made, and without him, nothing was made that has been made. Do you remember when at the very first page of the Bible in Genesis, when God says, "Let there be light," and creation comes into being? In a way, the rest of Scripture tells us that Jesus was those words, the "let there be light." Like he was the force that actually created. So God speaks it, the Spirit is there working and operating, and Jesus is doing it. And Colossians would tell us that everything was made through him and by him, and it's for him and to him. Like this is why it's so huge that he came to be like one of us. The one who walked up dusty mountain roads in Jerusalem had created those roads. The one who allowed himself to be baptized in the Jordan River had caused water and rivers to flow. The one who was in charge of everything chose to give his life as a sacrifice for his creation. Is that not unbelievable? This is why Christmas is so powerful. Because it goes on to say, in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. We'll talk about that in a few weeks. It's not as if there's light in the middle surrounded by darkness. It's actually darkness is a small spot surrounded by light. Everything has to bend its knee to light. Everything bends its knee to Christ. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. And here's where it gets interesting. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Light is relief unless you want to stay in the dark, right? I remember as a teenager, when I was in my highly rebellious years, I'm sure I had my cycle like the people of Israel, like you did. I should have been able to wake up with an alarm clock, but I didn't. My mom had to come in every morning to wake me up. Any of you had teenage boys like this? And the way that she would do it was to flip the light on, rip the covers off, and start singing something, And I would do like you. I would no, and pull the covers over, and I wanted to stay in the dark. The light was not relief to me in that moment. Silly example. But to the people of Israel that had expectations for what God was supposed to do when he sent Messiah, for who Jesus was supposed to be, whenever he came and did not meet their expectation or didn't behave in the way that they could predict, they, instead of feeling relief from that light, they squeezed their eyes shut and tried to block it out. And I want us to begin the Advent season with wondering if maybe we do the same thing. I'm not going to give you necessarily a practical application to this message that you can put into practice tomorrow and work it all out this week like I often like to do. What I'm going to ask you to do is to consider where in your life you might be choosing to stay in the darkness. That before we go to celebrate the light that has come and all that that means, that we first need to recognize, is there a place that I want to just squeeze my eyes shut and say no thanks? Oftentimes it's because God doesn't meet our expectations. So maybe your expectation is that when you become a Christian, when God comes in your life, everything is going to become like super easy. Did anyone have that expectation? Has anyone had that experience? Right? No, that's not what happens. It's not suddenly all roses and butterflies. When we come to faith in Christ, the road is still difficult, but he's just there with us constantly. And our hope is that this is not the end, no matter how difficult it gets, no matter how dark it is. Maybe your expectation is that he's just going to make all the people who disagree with you, like, teach them a lesson. That was one of the expectations for the Jews. Anybody who doesn't think like I do, God, show them, punish them. And then you find that, he actually doesn't hate those on the other side that watch the other news channel or vote the other way or have the other worldview. That's not what he did, and sometimes we squeeze our eyes shut. Maybe your expectation is too low. Like you've just come to believe that God is not going to show up and do what you need. You've prayed the prayer and you've waited for a while and you finally said, God, that's enough. I'm not waiting any longer. And so now your expectation is that he just doesn't care. No matter what it is where your expectation is off, I want to ask you to consider the story of the one who kind of got this all started for us in the last few minutes I have, and to choose to have the same approach that she did. She was a girl who was waiting, probably 14 or 15 years old. She was waiting to be married. She had a guy that she had picked out or that was picked out for her that was a good guy. He was going to care for her well. He loved God, and it was going to be great. The future in her mind was off and running. His name was Joseph. You might know her. Her name's Mary. And Mary was ready to get married, but she was also waiting, just like the rest of the people of Israel, for the Messiah to come. She experienced the pain of Roman oppression. She experienced the wait for God to do things differently and turn everything around. And she was waiting for that too. And one day, the story goes, an angel showed up in her house, an angel of light, a guy named Gabriel. Now, if an angel shows up in your house and starts speaking to you, if it happens today, most likely our first response will be to help you find someone to talk to and some pills because something has gone terribly wrong. And I just want you to understand that that would be the same kind of response for this girl named Mary. It doesn't happen very often. So imagine how just upended her world is when Gabriel shows up in her living room and says, Mary, God has looked on you and he's impressed. Not impressed with you, but he loves you and he's approved of you. He's found favor in you. And so something's going to happen here. You know that long-awaited rescuer, savior that we've been holding on to? Well, you're going to be the vehicle to deliver it. And imagine, again, 14, 15 years old. What were you doing at 15? She looks at the angel, and she has the same question that you and I would have. How? This doesn't make any sense to me. Besides, I'm a virgin. And Gabriel goes on to say, well, the Holy Spirit's going to come, and he's going to create this child in your womb. This place of safety, place of dignity where the image of God is implanted on every child. He's going to create the Son of God in you, and then you're going to birth him, and you're going to call him Jesus. And you have to understand, you have to imagine just how wrecked she is at this moment. Like, everything about her expectations is completely blown now, right? The way life was going to go, what was going to happen next, her marriage, everything. And look, we read the rest of the story. You know what happened. She became this scandal. Her choosing or her experiencing this gift of God made her be ostracized, outcast, looked down on and distrusted. She was suspicious. Everything changed. This was not her expectation. The angel doesn't tell her how exactly and when exactly. He doesn't go through and give her a long list of rational reasons why she's the right person and how this is going to work later. He simply says, this is happening to you. And Mary's response is what I want us to try to adopt. It is unbelievable for a person of any age, but especially a scared teenager. This is what she says. I am the Lord's servant, Mary answered. May your word to me be fulfilled. I don't understand this. I'm not even sure if I like this. I don't know what this is going to mean for my future. But may your word to me be fulfilled. God, this was not my expectation. I thought it would be different than this, but may your word to me be fulfilled. One translator says it like this: let it be to me as you say. This is the attitude that I want us to try to walk into the next 4 weeks with. God, whatever it is that you're doing in and around me right now, whatever it is that you want, I don't like it, I don't understand it, it wasn't my expectation, but let it be to me as you say. Do you think this might change things for you? If you could really, really mean it, embrace that. That prayer that you've been praying and holding on to for God to answer and to show up, just because he hasn't done it yet doesn't mean he won't. I mean, we just heard light is, it's no time for him. He's not like going slow. Everything that is happening, he's doing in exactly the right moment, and it's all the same day. We just have to let it catch up. Just because he hasn't done it yet doesn't mean he won't. But so many of us, because he hasn't done it the way we want, we squeeze our eyes closed and we just want to say, I don't want to see the light then. I'll rather stay in my darkness. What Christmas has offered all of us is the relief of God not only being present, but active in your life right now. And I wonder if you and I could do just an evaluation, if we could just consider where God hasn't met our expectations and we adjust rather than him. What might that mean for you? Maybe it's about the situation that you have going on at school or at work. Maybe it's a friend thing that can't get resolved, like you don't know why, but all of a sudden you're on the outside of the group that you once were on the inside of, and this doesn't make sense, and you prayed and God is just working. Maybe that's how you need to say, let it be to me as you say, God. I'll just be with you. Maybe it's something that's financial, or maybe it's a relationship thing with a spouse. Maybe it's pain and grief that you feel like won't end. It won't last forever. The light always comes. Christmas is our reminder, whether you feel alone or disoriented, forgotten or abandoned, it's not going to stay that way. And if we might, in the next few weeks, evaluate our own lives and choose to just receive what God is doing, to have eyes open to see the miracle that is around us all the time, I think we'll experience this season in much powerful, transformative ways than we have before. What could it look like for you? Where are you squinting your eyes to not see the light?